Every 4 years, the US election cycle is brought into focus as a potential disruptor to economies, geopolitical relationships, and financial markets. The question has been asked, will the current election affect gold, and to what degree? We have some answers, and some of what we share might surprise you. Now before we begin, we need to level set. Our videos take time to produce and it can make covering current events challenging. At this current moment, the most recent and relevant news is that President Biden has ended his 2024 campaign and endorsed his Vice President Kamala Harris, who appears to be close to securing the nomination. This, of course, is also after the attempted assassination of former President Trump. If another event occurs between now and when this video launches, it may seem a touch off, but we are going to zoom out and focus on the overall impact of elections across history and the way it historically has affected gold. And there is something unique and slightly unusual about this election cycle, and we'll cover that too. So first, what has the impact to gold been from past US elections? Does gold perform differently under Democrats or Republicans? It may shock you to hear that there is no statistically significant difference between the two parties as far as gold's performance goes. However, there are some slight differences in demand. When a Democrat is elected president, demand for physical gold bullion does notably increase. This is likely due to the expected impact of Democrat policies, which tend to be expensive. The more money the government spends that it doesn't have, the more inflation tends to grow. The expectation may increase bullion demand among retail investors. And this gets to the root of the issue. Gold does not typically move because of electoral outcomes, but financial markets, the value of the US dollar, inflation, interest rates, and the monetary supply does have an effect on gold, and the policies of sitting presidents can affect those items. So there may be a delay between when a president takes over and implements their policies and when gold reacts. One of the well-known correlations that exists with gold is the negative correlation to the US dollar. If the dollar goes up, the price of gold goes down. We have also observed a strong correlation to real interest rates in a similar manner, where negative real interest rates drives the value of gold up. And finally, we know that gold tracks well with inflation over the long run, measured in years, rather than months, weeks, or days. Whether we have a Harris or a Trump presidency, one thing that is also unique about this election is that we can look to past performance of both administrations to see if there have been policies that might affect gold's value. And if we assume a continuation of those policies, we might be able to peer past the curtain a little and make some assumptions. Now, first and most importantly, both administrations have wildly outspent budgets to a degree we've never before witnessed in American history. Both added trillions to the national debt, devaluing the dollar and increasing inflation. Now, while it's unclear who outspent the other due to misinformation and political infighting, it's undeniable that both contributed to the debt and that the full ramifications of that have yet to be felt. There is no indication from either party that they have a solution to the growing debt burden and have largely given the issue the silent treatment on the campaign trail. A continuation of prior spending habits will only have one result: a weaker US dollar, inflation, and the rise of gold. At the start of Trump's term on January 20th, 2017, gold was close to $1,200 per troy ounce. Just before COVID began, gold was approximately $1,480 per troy ounce. When Biden took office, gold was approximately $1,870 per troy ounce. A few years later, and gold has reached new all-time highs at $2,483. The backdrop, of course, is high inflation, heightened geopolitical risks, bank failures, and war. So historically, it appears that both candidates have promoted policies that drove the spot price of gold up. But there is another factor in this election that might be a consideration. And that factor is the Federal Reserve. We are all aware the end of the tightening cycle is getting closer and interest rates are expected to ease in the near future. Although there is some separation from politics, the independence of the Federal Reserve has been repeatedly called into question as potential rate cuts are expected to fall just before the November election. On July 10th, Congressman Mike Lawler asked Powell a very pointed question during a congressional hearing. His words were, "Since you made mention of the independence of the Fed, and I know you pride yourself on that independence, do you acknowledge, or do members of the Federal Open Market Committee acknowledge that a rate cut in September could be viewed as political just 30 to 60 days before an election?" It's an important question and one that Powell provided a boilerplate response to, claiming that the Federal Reserve is an independent institution and decisions will be made based on the data regardless of the timing of U.S. elections. However, after the June FOMC meeting, reporters asked questions regarding expected rate cuts, and there was some daylight between the data and the intended action. Now, the Fed is expecting virtually no change or further progress on inflation through the end of the year. This is according to their models. So to paraphrase Michael McKee from Bloomberg during the June FOMC press conference, if at the end of the year there is no change from conditions now, why would you anticipate cutting rates? What would be the point of a rate cut? And Powell's response did not address the difference in the model's expected outcomes the committee was using and the committee's projected rate cut this year. Well, why is this important? Well, because it's possible that politics are playing a role and that could affect markets, including the gold market. Now, before we explain further, let's be clear, this is a bit speculative, but it's based on studying the statements of Federal Reserve board members, their interactions with Congress, and also with journalists who are rightly watching this institution's moves closely. Checks and balances do exist, after all, because of mankind's propensity to abuse systems of power. If there is a political component to the Federal Reserve's decision-making, it could result in a false start to the end of the tightening cycle. It would be unsurprising if a decision was made for political purposes to see one rate cut before the election, followed by a long pause before additional cuts are made. There is a noticeable impact to markets when the Federal Reserve makes public statements, and the effect has been studied. It's why statements are prepared so carefully by board members and they attempt to stay on script. For example, when Christopher Waller hinted at future rate cuts in 2024 at the end of last year, gold skyrocketed, hit new all-time highs. Shortly after, equity markets were equally enthusiastic. Markets are forward-looking, after all. It would not take much to excite investors and move markets, especially with the anticipation of rate cuts that has existed all year. If there is a political lean to the Federal Reserve, they would not need to do much more than cut rates once and release a honeymoon statement, then return to a holding pattern at the new level. After some time, the excitement could wear off, the prices of various assets may potentially deflate. In a normal election cycle, the Federal Reserve does not have such potent power. The timing of events just happens to line up to give them a unique lever. And it's entirely possible that Powell is good to his word and the decisions are being made solely on data. So none of this might be anything more than the concerns of well-meaning watchdog organizations and a few conspiracy theorists. But it's best that each person take the time to draw their own conclusions and invest in a manner that aligns to their personal circumstance. Now, before we wrap up, we do have one request. We'd love to hear if you think a rate cut is coming before the November election and what effect you think it might have. But if you're going to leave a comment below, please be decent to your neighbors. Politics can bring out great passion in people, but we can choose to be our best selves and would appreciate your thoughtfulness when commenting. Thank you. That's all we have for you today. Please remember to like, subscribe, and share with a friend. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.